The Whitmore Grand was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel like trespassers. 40-foot ceilings draped in cascading crystal chandeliers, waitstaff gliding between guests with the practiced invisibility of ghosts, and 200 of Chicago's most carefully curated elite gathered in the ballroom to celebrate the engagement of Preston Harwick, heir to Harwick Capital, and whatever arm candy he'd decided was worthy of his name this season. Wren Calloway stood near the east wall, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, wearing a burgundy dress her mother had spent 3 weeks talking her into. She was 29 years old, the sharpest forensic accountant at Aldridge and Crane, and she had spent the last 6 minutes being looked through by people she'd spent the last 3 years making rich. Not looked at, looked through. There was a difference, and Wren had learned it early. She was a size 18 in a room full of size 4s, and in this particular ecosystem, that was the only math that seemed to matter to anyone. Across the room, Preston Harwick laughed at something his father said, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, his future hanging off his arm like a diamond pendant. Her name was Sloane. She was 24, stunning in the geometric way that fashion magazines liked, and she had spent the evening curating her angles for the photographer circling the room. Wren had once spent 14 months untangling a $4.2 million embezzlement scheme buried inside Harwick Capital's offshore accounts. Preston had thanked her with a gift card to a restaurant that had a 2-week wait list and promptly forgotten her face. She was used to it. What she was not used to was the man watching her from the mezzanine. She noticed him the way you notice a drop in temperature, not a specific sensation, but an awareness that something in the room had changed. She glanced up without meaning to. He was leaning against the railing with the kind of stillness that didn't come from patience. It came from power, the sort of man who had long since stopped needing to move toward things, because things came to him. He was tall, dark suit, no tie, collar open at the throat. Early 40s, she guessed, that looked like it had been through something and come out on the other side sharper for it. He wasn't watching the party. He wasn't watching Preston or Sloane or the photographer or the ice sculpture slowly weeping into a silver tray. He was watching her. Wren looked away, told herself it was a mistake. A misread. Men like that didn't watch women like her. Not the way he was watching her, like she was a puzzle he'd already started solving. She lasted 40 seconds before she looked back. He was still there, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was almost, not quite, a smile. His name was Reed Calloway, no relation, as the universe apparently found that sort of irony amusing, and she didn't know that yet. What she knew in that moment was that her water glass had gone warm in her hand, and the room suddenly felt several degrees smaller. She found out who he was 40 minutes later, in the way you find out things at parties like this, through the low-grade whisper network that moved faster than the champagne. Reed Calloway, founder and majority shareholder of Calloway Strategic Group, a private investment firm that existed in the precise gray space between legitimate finance and the kind of leverage that made city councilmen return phone calls at midnight. He had bought and dissolved 3 of Harwick Capital's competitors in the last 5 years. He controlled more of the city's financial infrastructure than most people knew existed. And he did all of it quietly, surgically, with the kind of precision that left no visible marks. He was, in the language of the room, untouchable. She was standing near the coat check when he appeared beside her. Not in front of her, beside her. As though he'd been there for a while and she'd simply failed to notice, which was, she suspected, exactly the impression he intended. "You've been running numbers in your head all night," he said. She didn't startle. She prided herself on that. "Excuse me? You looked at the ice sculpture for 30 seconds and I'm willing to bet you calculated the melt rate." His voice was low, even, not a voice that needed volume to carry weight. "You've been the most interesting person in this room for 2 hours. That's a low bar," she said. "It's a room full of people describing their vacation homes to each other. I've heard 4 different versions of someone's trip to Lake Como. I've heard 6. She turned to look at him directly for the first time. Up close, he was more, she didn't have a cleaner word for it, more present. His eyes were dark grey, the colour of weather, and they didn't move off her face in the way she'd spent a lifetime bracing for. Why were you watching me? Because you're the only one in there doing actual work while pretending to do nothing. A beat. And because I know who you are. Her chin lifted slightly. Should I be worried about that? Depends on why you think I'd ask that question. She studied him for a moment the way she studied financial documents, looking for the thing that didn't add up, the number that broke the pattern. You want something, she said. I always want something. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, plain matte black, nothing on it but a number. I'd like to offer you a meeting, tomorrow morning. My offices, I have a job. I know you're very good at it. His eyes didn't move. I need someone better. She didn't take the card immediately. That would have been too easy, and Wren Calloway had learned very young not to give anyone easy. What kind of meeting? She asked. The kind where I tell you what I need, and you tell me whether you're interested, and we both go home having wasted nothing. He set the card on the coat check counter beside her. 7 a.m. Calloway Group, 43rd floor. A pause. Wear something comfortable. It'll be a long conversation. He walked back into the party without looking back. She picked up the card. The offices were exactly what she'd expected. Clean lines, city view, the deliberate absence of anything decorative. Money that was confident enough in itself not to perform. What she hadn't expected was the woman already seated in the conference room when she arrived. Late 50s, silver hair, reading glasses perched at the end of her nose, reviewing what appeared to be Wren's entire professional history printed across a series of documents. Theodora Blaine, the woman said without looking up. I've managed Mr. Calloway's operations for 11 years. Sit down, please. We have a lot of ground to cover. Wren sat. Reed Calloway came in 7 minutes later with 2 coffees and the focused calm of a man who had already resolved this morning's most significant problems before she'd finished parking. He set 1 coffee in front of her, took the seat across, and said nothing while he looked at the documents Theodora was still arranging. Then he looked at her. Here's what I need, he said. Harwick Capital is about to acquire 3 mid-tier regional banks. The deal closes in 6 weeks. I have reason to believe the acquisition paperwork contains deliberate structural errors, not mistakes, errors, that will allow Harwick to siphon liability into the acquired institutions while retaining the assets. The kind of thing that takes 18 months to unravel after the fact. Wren was quiet for a moment. That's securities fraud. Among other things, why do you care? You're not on the acquiring end. I am on the regulatory exposure end. His jaw moved slightly. And I have a personal interest in ensuring Preston Harwick doesn't finish this deal intact. There it was, the thing under the thing. Personal. He took something from me. No elaboration, no visible emotion, just the fact, clean and final, like a number in a ledger. I want it documented before the close. I want the error trail pulled apart by someone who can't be bought and can't be intimidated. And I need it done without tipping Harwick's internal audit team. That's 6 weeks of full-time work. I know I have a full-time job. I'll pay you 4 times your annual salary for the 6 weeks. Full legal immunity through my firm's counsel. And if you find what I think you'll find, your name goes on the regulatory submission that ends Preston Harwick's career. He leaned forward slightly. Or I can find someone else, and you can go back to making Preston Harwick rich for the standard fee. The silence in the room was the kind that wasn't empty. It was the kind that was full of something being decided. Not fishing. Genuinely calculating. Because you already found it once, he said, 3 years ago. The offshore structure in his Cayman entity. You flagged it internally, and it was buried by senior partners. He watched her. I know you know what's in those accounts. And I know they made you sign something that said you didn't. The air in her lungs did something uncomfortable. How do you know that? She asked quietly. Because I pay attention to the people this city throws away. He said it without theatricality, without softness. As a fact, the same way he said everything. Made powerful people nervous, and they handled you the way they handle things that make them nervous. I find that useful to track. Theodora set a non-disclosure agreement on the table between them. Ren looked at it, looked at him, thought about the NDA she'd already signed 3 years ago, and what it had cost her. "I'll need full access to the acquisition documents," she said, "and I mean full. Nothing filtered. Done. I'll need my own secure workspace. Not inside this building. Done. And if I find something that goes beyond Harwick, something that touches your firm, I follow it." The first real pause. His eyes didn't move. "Done," he said quieter. She picked up the pen. She found the first thread on day 4. It was buried in a footnote of a subsidiary merger agreement, a liability carve-out, written in language so deliberately opaque that she almost missed it. Almost. She sat with it for 2 hours, built it out in a spreadsheet, traced it backward through 4 corporate entities, and by the time she was done, what she had looked less like a mistake and more like architecture. Deliberate, elegant, monstrous. She called Reed at 11 p.m. He answered on the second ring. "Talk to me," he said. She talked. He listened without interrupting, which she was beginning to understand was how he operated. Total stillness when receiving information, the way a sensor goes quiet to better detect signal. When she finished, the silence lasted 4 seconds. "Send it to me," he said. "Encrypted. I want to keep building it before we send anything anywhere. This is one thread. There are others." "How many?" "I don't know yet. But whoever designed this was good." She paused. "They made one mistake." "What kind?" "They reused a structural pattern from a 2019 deal. I've seen that pattern before. Someone taught it to someone, and that someone is still using it." She was quiet for a moment. This didn't come from Harwick's internal team. This was contracted out, which means there's a paper trail somewhere that connects to a name. She heard something shift on his end. Not quite a breath. Not quite a word. "Find the name," he said. She found 4 more threads in the following week. They connected in the way lies connect when they're told by people who are careful but not careful enough. Each one almost clean on its own, but together forming a shape that was unmistakable. She built a map of it, a real map, with nodes and lines, and the elegant ugliness of a scheme that had been running for years. She also started to notice she wasn't doing it alone, not in an obvious way. There were no extra hands on the documents, no meetings she hadn't requested. But resources appeared when she needed them. A contact at the FDIC who returned her call within the hour, a clearance level on a regulatory database that should have taken weeks to obtain, a specific 2017 document that had been archived so thoroughly she'd only found a reference to it in a footnote. All of it moving her forward, all of it traceable if she looked, back to quiet decisions someone had made on her behalf. She didn't bring it up for 9 days. Then she walked into his office without an appointment, set a printed timeline on his desk and said, "You've been running interference for me." He didn't deny it. "I've been removing obstacles. That's the same thing." "It's not, actually." He leaned back. "Removing obstacles is what you do for someone who's doing the work. Running interference is what you do for someone who can't." She stood there for a moment. "You didn't tell me. Would you have accepted it if I had?" The honest answer was no. She knew her own wiring well enough for that. "Don't do it without telling me," agreed. A pause. "For what it's worth, you didn't need most of it. You were faster than I expected." "You should have expected it," she said, and walked out. She didn't see the way he watched the door after she left, but Theodora did. And Theodora had been watching Reed Calloway for 11 years, and she recognized the expression on his face. She'd stopped seeing it a long time ago. She was glad to see it back. The name turned up on day 19. Arthur Fenway, a forensic accountant, her field, her specialty, her vocabulary, who had left conventional practice 12 years ago to consult privately for a small list of very wealthy clients. His fingerprints were on the 2019 deal, on a 2021 restructuring for one of Harwick's shell companies, on the current acquisition in the form of a methodology so specific it brought it to Reed on a Tuesday morning. She brought it to on a Tuesday morning. He went very still when she said the name. "You know him," she said. Was level, too level. "Before he worked for Harwick. How long ago? 8 years." A pause. "He left under circumstances I chose not to pursue at the time." She let that sit. What did he take? Raid was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, 43 floors down, the city continued its business with cheerful indifference. A client, and everything that client knew about my operations. He looked at her. "It nearly cost me the company, and you didn't pursue it. I chose to rebuild instead of retaliate." Something moved behind his eyes. "That was either wisdom or a mistake, depending on how this ends. It's going to end with his name on a regulatory filing," she said, "and Preston Harwick's, and possibly 3 of Harwick's senior partners." She slid a document across the desk. "I need you to look at this and tell me if I'm missing anything." He read it the way she'd learned he read things. Straight through, no expression, nothing written on his face until he'd finished the last word. Then he set it down and looked at her with something she hadn't seen on him before. "You're not missing anything," he said. "This is everything." "I know." She gathered the document. "I'd like to submit it by the end of the week. Ren." He said her name the way he said most things, directly, without decoration, but there was a weight under it that made her pause. "When this is done—" "I know," she said again. "It'll be done. That's not what I was going to say." She waited. "When this is done," he said, "I'd like to take you to dinner." The room was very quiet. "That's a different conversation," she said carefully. "It is." He didn't look away. "I'm telling you in advance so it doesn't surprise you." "I don't think you like being surprised." She considered him for a moment. This man who had watched her from a mezzanine and said she was the most interesting person in a room full of people, who had removed obstacles without announcing it, who had read her wiring more accurately in 6 weeks than most people had in 6 years. And then, because she was nothing, if not precise, "I'll consider it." She walked out. This time, she allowed herself a small smile on the other side of the door. Just for a second, just enough. The submission went in on a Thursday. Ren sat in a secure conference room at the offices of the Financial Regulatory Authority with 3 investigators, 2 federal attorneys, and Theodora Blaine taking meticulous minutes, and she walked them through every thread, every node, every pattern. 2 hours and 40 minutes, no notes. She'd had the map in her head for 2 weeks by then. When she finished, the senior investigator looked at the documents in front of him and said quietly, "This is the most thorough private submission I've seen in 11 years." She said, "Thank you," and meant it as a fact, not a compliment. The freeze on the Harwick acquisition was issued before the end of business that day. Preston Harwick's response, according to sources that Theodora relayed with the precise satisfaction of a woman delivering long-deserved news, was to call 3 senior partners into his office and spend 40 minutes insisting there had been a mistake. The senior partners, understanding which direction the wind had changed, spent the 40 minutes after that calling their own attorneys. Arthur Fenway's response was to attempt to leave the country, an effort that was interrupted at O'Hare International Airport by 2 federal agents and the specific kind of paperwork that Ren had been careful to include in the submission for exactly that reason. She found out about the airport from Reed at 8:15 that evening via text. It was 2 words. "He's detained." She stared at the message for a moment. Then she typed back, "Good." A pause. Then, still interested in dinner. She put her phone down and looked at her apartment. The whiteboard covered in a 6-week map of fraud, the coffee cups she'd stopped counting, the quiet she'd gotten used to spending alone. The work was done, and it turned out that what came after the work was something she hadn't planned for. She was still thinking about it when another message came through. Friday. 7. I'll send an address. Wear whatever you want. The reservation doesn't care. She laughed. Alone in her apartment at 9 o'clock on a Thursday, she laughed out loud at her phone, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in longer than she could quickly calculate. She typed, "Friday works." The dinner reservation turned out to be a 12-person private room at a restaurant that didn't have a sign outside. where the owner came to the table personally and addressed Reed by first name and her by Miss Calloway, which startled her, and apparently delighted him in a way he was careful not to show. She wore a deep teal dress she'd bought on impulse 6 months ago and never had occasion for. When she walked in, Reed stood up from the table. Not as a performance, just stood, like it was the obvious thing to do. "You look," he started. "Don't say different," she said. "I was going to say formidable. A beat, but that's how you always look, so I understand why you'd preempt me." She sat down. He sat across from her, and the evening began. They talked for 3 hours. Not about the case. That was over, a sealed chapter. They talked about everything adjacent to it. The way money moved through systems, the particular psychology of people who believed rules were for others, the books they'd both read about collapse, and what came after. At some point, she mentioned that she'd known about the offshore structure 3 years ago, and what had been done with that knowledge. And he said, without looking away from her, "I know, and I want you to know I am sorry that happened to you." "You didn't do it," she said. "No, but I benefited from the people who did, indirectly, and I should have found you sooner." She looked at him. "That's a strange thing to say." "It's true." He reached across and refilled her water glass, a small, precise gesture. "I've known about you for longer than 6 weeks, Ren. I've been watching your work for 2 years. I should have made this offer sooner." She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you?" "Because I wanted to make sure I was coming to you with something worth your time." He set the water pitcher down. "You don't take things that aren't worth your time. I've noticed that about you." She had noticed, over the course of 6 weeks, that this was how he said things that were significant. The same way he said everything else, in the same tone, with the same economy of expression. It meant she had to pay attention to know when something was important, and she found, sitting across from him in a restaurant where the owner knew his name, that she was paying attention with a focus she usually reserved for documents. "The submission has my name on it," she said. "It does. That's going to change things at Aldridge and Crane. I suspect it will. I might not have a job to go back to." He looked at her steadily. "Calloway Strategic Group is looking for a director of financial integrity. It's a new position, salaried with full authority over investigative scope and zero tolerance for people who try to bury what you find." A pause. "It's yours if you want it. Not as a thank you, as a hire. You'd be the most qualified person for the role in the city." She set down her fork. "You planned this," she said. "I hoped," he said. "There's a difference." She sat with that for a moment, with the strange, slightly dizzying sensation of being in a room where she was being seen, not looked through, not reduced to a size or a shape or a number that didn't add up to someone's expectations, just seen. Clearly, accurately, as exactly what she was. "I'll think about it," she said. "The position. Take your time. I won't take long." She picked her fork back up. "I don't like loose ends." He didn't quite smile, but something in his face settled into something that might have been better than a smile. The particular expression of a person who has found exactly what they were looking for and is steady enough not to make a scene about it. 3 months later, Ren Calloway walked into the 43rd floor of Calloway's Strategic Group, set her laptop bag on a desk with her name on the door, and opened a new case file. The Harwick acquisition had collapsed completely. Preston Harwick had resigned from his own company. In a statement his PR team spent 4 days crafting, and that still managed to sound like what it was: a man who had been outmaneuvered by the person he'd spent 3 years looking through. Arthur Fenway was cooperating with federal investigators. His cooperation, Wren had privately noted, would make no significant difference to the outcome. She had documented everything so completely that his testimony was useful but not necessary. At Aldridge and Crane, the 3 senior partners who had buried her original flag were under their own separate review. 2 of them had resigned. None of this, she told people when they asked, felt like revenge. Revenge was emotional. What she had done was restore accuracy to a system that had been deliberately made inaccurate. She was a forensic accountant. That was the job. What she didn't tell people What she kept close, in the quiet place she kept things that were hers, was what it had felt like to sit at a restaurant with a man who had watched her from a mezzanine and decided before she knew his name that she was the most interesting person in the room. She had been looked through for so long that being seen had felt, at first, like a misread, a mistake, a kindness that would come with a cost she hadn't yet located. But Reed Calloway, she was learning, did not do things by accident. He did not look at something without meaning to, and he did not say a person was worth his attention without having already diced it thoroughly and without reservation. That they were. She was still getting used to that. Some mornings she would catch him watching her across the open floor of the office. Not the glassy, abstracted gaze people gave their employees, but the specific, direct attention of a person who found the thing they were watching genuinely interesting. And she would hold it for a moment, this new, unfamiliar experience of being the thing someone looked at instead of past, and she would think, so this is what this feels like. It felt, she was gradually concluding, exactly like being correct. And Ren Calloway had always been very comfortable with being correct.